The applause started before anyone understood what they were watching. In the marble lobby of a 58-story tower in Manhattan, on a gray autumn afternoon with rain tapping softly against the glass doors, two security guards gripped the arms of a woman in a tailored charcoal suit and walked her toward the exit as if she were nothing more than a trespasser caught in the wrong building. She did not struggle, but her voice carried across the entire lobby, sharp and unwavering. She told them, again and again, that she was the chief executive of a technology corporation about to sign a contract worth billions of dollars, and that removing her from the building would cost thousands of people their livelihoods. Nobody believed her. Some employees lifted their phones to record the spectacle, laughing quietly behind their hands, while the building management stood with arms crossed, satisfied that order had been restored. In the far corner of the atrium, a man in a plain gray coat, still carrying the weight of a long flight, stood perfectly still and watched. He said nothing. He simply looked at the small brass nameplate pinned above the woman's blazer, the one that read Helix Dynamics, and something in his expression shifted from mild curiosity into quiet alarm. Then, without raising his voice, without rushing, he began to walk toward the center of the commotion, and the words he spoke next would freeze the security guards, silence the crowd, and change the course of everything that followed. He said only, "I am sorry, but this is my building." 10 minutes earlier, the lobby of that tower had been ordinary in every way. A Tuesday afternoon in October could be ordinary. Investors moved briskly across the polished floor with coffee cups in hand. Elevators chimed every few seconds, and the rain outside blurred the city into soft gray light. Victoria Hayes had walked through those revolving doors the way she always did, with quick, purposeful steps and a leather folder tucked under one arm, because in less than 40 minutes, she was expected on the 50th floor for the most important negotiation of her career. She had spent 10 years building Helix Dynamics from a modest office, with 3 employees, into a company that now occupied 3 entire floors of that very tower. And today, if the meeting went as planned, a partnership worth billions of dollars would finally be signed. But when she pressed her identification card against the turnstile, the small green light that always granted her passage flashed red instead. She tried again, assuming a technical glitch. And again the light rejected her. A security guard approached, polite at first, asking for a photo identification, and when she offered her executive badge, he studied it as though it were a forgery. Within minutes, a small crowd of onlookers had gathered, murmuring, filming, enjoying the strange theater of a well-dressed woman, insisting she owned 3 floors of a building that no longer recognized her name. She explained, calmly at first, that she was the chief executive officer, that her meeting could not wait, that an error had clearly been made somewhere in the system. Her calm did not last. As the minutes ticked by, and the guards tightened their grip on her arms to walk her toward the doors, her voice rose into something closer to desperation, because she understood, better than anyone in that lobby, exactly what was at stake if she did not reach the 50th floor in time. The rain outside had grown heavier, streaking the tall windows in long silver lines, and somewhere in the crowd, a young intern whispered to a colleague that this was the most interesting thing that had happened in the building all year, as though watching a woman lose her dignity in public were nothing more than a diversion from an otherwise dull afternoon. Victoria's folder had slipped from her grip at some point during the struggle, its contents scattering across the polished floor, pages of financial projections and signature pages for the very contract she was rushing to close, now trampled beneath the shoes of onlookers who did not bother to step around them. She did not reach for the papers. She could not with 2 guards holding her arms, and the sight of her work, her 10 years of effort, lying crumpled and ignored on marble tile, seemed to hurt her more than the humiliation of the crowd itself. It was in that exact moment, as the guards pulled her toward the revolving doors, and the crowd's laughter grew louder, that Ethan Carter stepped through the entrance behind her, unnoticed, dressed like any other tired traveler returning from a long trip. Nobody in that lobby recognized his face, because Ethan Carter had spent the better part of 15 years building a fortune in real estate, while making absolutely certain that his face never appeared beside his name in any public record. He owned buildings across 3 states, including the very tower they were standing in. Yet he moved through the world dressed like an accountant, drove nothing flashier than a gray sedan, and preferred silence to attention in every room he entered. He paused near a marble column and watched the scene unfold. At first, assuming it was simply an unruly visitor being escorted out for causing a disturbance, the kind of minor incident every large building endured from time to time. But something about the woman's insistence caught his attention, not because she was loud, but because of what she kept repeating beneath the noise of the crowd. She said the name of a corporation he recognized instantly, because he personally approved every lease agreement in that tower, and Helix Dynamics was one of the largest tenants he had. Ethan's eyes moved from her face to the badge clipped to her blazer, then to the panicked expression of a woman who clearly believed every word she was saying. He did not move immediately. He simply watched, cataloging details the way he always did before acting, until Victoria's voice cracked with the final warning she shouted toward the guards, telling them that if she did not reach that meeting, thousands of employees would pay the price for their mistake. Ethan crossed the lobby with unhurried steps, his presence so unremarkable that nobody turned to look at him until he was already standing beside the security desk. He asked, in a voice too calm to belong to a stranger who had simply wandered into chaos, what exactly had happened here. The building manager, a heavyset man named Daniel Cole who wore his authority like an ill-fitting suit, explained with visible pride that an unauthorized individual had attempted to impersonate a corporate executive in order to gain access to restricted floors, and that security protocol had been followed precisely. Ethan studied him for a long moment before speaking again, his tone still even, still unreadable. Victoria, exhausted and humiliated, glanced at him briefly, assuming he was simply another curious bystander who happened to ask a reasonable question, and she offered him a tired, grateful nod for at least treating her like a human being. Ethan did not explain who he was. Instead, he pulled a slim tablet from his coat, one that few people in that lobby would have recognized as a master access device tied directly to the building's central security system, and within seconds, he confirmed exactly what he already suspected. Victoria Hayes held full executive clearance under a contract signed 18 months earlier. A clearance that, according to every rule governing that tower, could never be revoked without written authorization from the building's ownership. And ownership, in this case, meant him. His jaw tightened slightly as he looked back toward Daniel Cole, and in a voice that had suddenly lost all its softness, he asked to see the complete access log for the past 24 hours. Daniel hesitated, then refused, insisting that internal records were confidential and that he had no obligation to share them with a stranger off the street. Ethan did not argue. He simply tapped twice on his tablet, and the entire security terminal behind the front desk blinked, then rebooted under a new administrative override that only one person in the world possessed the authority to trigger. What appeared on the screen made Daniel's face lose its color instantly. Exactly 1 hour earlier, Victoria Hayes's executive access had been manually deleted from the system, not by a glitch, not by an algorithm, but by a direct command entered under Daniel Cole's own credentials. Beside that entry sat something even more damning. An email sent from an internal account instructing the front desk to block, quote, any individual falsely claiming to be the chief executive of Helix Dynamics, unquote. Time to arrive precisely 7 minutes before Victoria walked through the doors. Ethan read the message twice, his expression darkening with a controlled, deliberate anger that had nothing to do with confusion and everything to do with certainty. This was not a mistake. This was not miscommunication. Someone inside that building, someone with detailed knowledge of Victoria's schedule and her company's internal structure, had orchestrated her public humiliation with surgical precision, timing it to occur just before the most important meeting of her professional life. Before Ethan could say another word, Victoria's phone rang, the sound sharp and sudden against the tense silence of the lobby. She answered with trembling hands, and the voice on the other end delivered news that made her knees weaken beneath her. The board of directors, in an emergency session convened without her knowledge less than an hour earlier, had voted to remove her as chief executive of the very company she had spent a decade building from nothing. She stood frozen, the phone still pressed against her ear long after the call had ended, staring blankly at the rain sliding down the glass doors she had almost been thrown through. 10 years of 18-hour days, of sacrificing relationships and sleep and every ordinary comfort, of building something from 3 employees and a modest office into a corporation now worth billions, had apparently been erased in the span of a single afternoon by people she had once trusted completely. Ethan watched her absorb the blow, watched the practiced composure of a seasoned executive crack for just a moment before she forced it back into place. And he found himself asking the only question that mattered in that instant, spoken so quietly that only she could hear it. He asked who stood to gain the most from her removal. Victoria answered without hesitation, because she had already begun to suspect the truth even before the board's call confirmed it. She spoke the name Marcus Reed, her company's vice president of operations, a man she had personally promoted 3 years earlier, a man who had smiled at her during every quarterly meeting while quietly building alliances behind closed doors. She explained that Marcus had grown increasingly vocal about wanting more control over strategic decisions, that he had recently formed unusually close relationships with 2 board members who had never particularly liked her leadership style, and that his ambition, which she had once mistaken for loyalty, now looked instead like patience. Ethan listened without interrupting, piecing together the fragments of her story, alongside the evidence already glowing on the tablet in his hand, and the picture forming in his mind grew clearer and more troubling with each new detail. A cancelled access badge, a fabricated email, a board vote timed to the exact hour of a billion-dollar negotiation. None of it was coincidence. He turned to Daniel Cole, his voice now carrying an authority the building manager had not heard from him before, and instructed him to freeze every system in the building immediately, locking all access logs, all camera footage, and all administrative permissions until further notice. Daniel, indignant and still unaware of who he was speaking to, drew himself up and demanded to know exactly who this stranger believed he was to be giving orders inside a building he did not own. Ethan did not answer him directly. Instead, he lifted his phone and made a single call, speaking only a few short words before ending it. 30 seconds passed in complete silence, the entire lobby watching without understanding why. Until every screen mounted across the atrium, the massive digital displays that normally advertised building amenities and tenant directories, flickered and changed all at once. Across every panel, in clean white letters against a black background, the same message appeared for the whole lobby to see. Owner authentication, successful, Ethan Carter. The reaction was immediate and total. Daniel Cole's face drained of every trace of color. And the 2 security guards who had dragged Victoria toward the exit released her arms as though they had been burned. Somewhere above, an alarm must have gone out through the building's management chain, because within moments the tower's chief operating officer came sprinting down the main staircase, his tie loosened, his breathing ragged, already apologizing before he had even reached the ground floor. He called out for someone to summon Mr. Carter immediately, unaware that the man he was frantically searching for stood only a few feet away, watching the chaos with the same unreadable calm he had carried since the moment he first walked through the doors. Victoria stared at him, the pieces slowly assembling themselves in her mind, disbelief spreading across her face as she understood, finally, that the quiet stranger who had asked a simple question in the middle of her worst humiliation was the very man who owned every floor of the building she had just been thrown out of. Ethan turned to face the crowd that had gathered, the same people who had laughed and filmed only minutes earlier, now standing in stunned, uncomfortable silence. His voice, when he finally spoke, was not raised, but it carried through the entire lobby with a weight that left no room for argument. He said that from this moment forward, no one in this building was permitted to lay a hand on Victoria Hayes again, under any circumstance, for any reason. He turned to Daniel Cole and instructed him to restore her executive access immediately, in full view of everyone present, so that there could be no ambiguity about what had just occurred. Daniel's hands shook as he typed the commands into the terminal. And within seconds, Victoria's badge, the same one dismissed as a forgery only minutes earlier, blinked green on the very first attempt. Ethan then asked for the building's security footage to be projected onto the largest screen in the atrium, And though Daniel hesitated, a single look from Ethan was enough to end any resistance. The footage rolled backward through the hour, revealing timestamps, login credentials, and finally the unmistakable image of Daniel Cole himself entering the command that erased Victoria's access, followed by a second clip showing an unfamiliar courier delivering an envelope to his office no more than 2 hours earlier. Whispers rippled through the crowd of investors and employees who had stopped to watch, and several of them, the same ones who had recorded Victoria's humiliation for entertainment, now lowered their phones in visible discomfort. Victoria stood at the center of it all, her composure gradually returning as the truth unfolded on the screen above her. The envelope, once opened by building security under Ethan's direct order, revealed a bank transfer confirmation, a sum large enough to explain exactly why a building manager would risk his career to humiliate a stranger. The money had come from an account Ethan recognized immediately, one tied to a shell company he had encountered before in unrelated business dealings, a shell company that, according to public filings, had been quietly established by none other than Marcus Reed 3 weeks earlier. The evidence no longer required speculation. It sat there, glowing on the screen for every investor, every employee, and every reporter who happened to be present to witness. Nearby, several of the very investors Victoria had been rushing to meet upstairs had gathered near the elevators. Drawn by the commotion, and they watched the unfolding revelation, with expressions shifting from curiosity to quiet outrage on Victoria's behalf. It was at that exact moment, as the tension in the lobby reached its peak, that the elevator doors chimed open, and Marcus Reed stepped out, dressed impeccably, smiling the same practiced smile he always wore, entirely unaware that the very evidence of his betrayal was already displayed 20 feet above his head. Before Marcus stepped out of that elevator, in the minutes while the lobby waited and whispered, Victoria found herself remembering the early years of Helix Dynamics, the cramped office above a laundromat in Brooklyn where she and 2 engineers had survived on instant noodles and stubborn belief, convinced that the software they were building would one day matter to someone beyond themselves. She remembered interviewing Marcus Reed for the first time, impressed by his sharp mind and his easy charm, never once suspecting that the same charisma that made him so persuasive in board meetings would eventually be turned into a weapon against her. Ethan watched her expression shift as these memories passed behind her eyes, and though he said nothing, he understood, in the particular way that only another builder of empires could understand, exactly how much it cost to watch something you created with your own hands nearly get stolen by someone you had once trusted completely. It was a quiet, private moment between 2 strangers who had known each other for less than an hour, and yet it felt, somehow, like the beginning of an understanding that would outlast the day itself. Marcus scanned the lobby, confusion flickering across his face as he registered the crowd, the darkened screens now glowing with financial records, and Victoria standing tall once again beside a man he did not recognize. He composed himself quickly, the way skilled liars always do, and declared loudly that this entire situation was clearly the fault of building management, that he had no idea what any of this had to do with him. Ethan simply gestured toward the screen without a word, allowing the footage to speak for itself. Investors who had gathered nearby began murmuring among themselves, several of them pulling out their own phones now, not to record entertainment, but to document what was quickly becoming the unraveling of a corporate conspiracy in real time. Marcus attempted to shift blame toward Daniel Cole, insisting the building manager had acted alone, but Ethan produced a second document from his tablet, one showing digital signatures on the wire transfer that matched, precisely, the signature on file for Marcus Reed's personal banking account. There was a chain of evidence now, unbroken and complete, connecting the fabricated email, the canceled access badge, the bribery payment, and the timing of the board's emergency vote, all pointing to a single architect standing in the middle of that lobby in an expensive suit, his composure finally beginning to fracture under the weight of what could no longer be denied. Victoria stepped forward then, closing the distance between herself and the man she had once trusted enough to promote into the second highest position in her company. Her voice, when she spoke, was steady in a way that surprised even her, carrying none of the panic from earlier and all of the authority she had spent 10 years earning. She asked him plainly whether 10 years of her life, the sacrifices, the sleepless nights, The company she had built from nothing had truly meant so little to him that he was willing to destroy it all simply to sit in her chair. Marcus said nothing at first, his silence answering the question more honestly than any denial could have. The lobby had grown utterly still. Every employee, every investor, every passerby who had wandered into the middle of this extraordinary scene, now watching in complete silence as the truth settled over the room like a slow, heavy fog. One of the senior investors, a gray-haired man who had flown in from Chicago, specifically for the meeting Victoria had nearly missed, stepped forward and addressed the gathering directly, his voice carrying the calm finality of someone who had seen enough corporate maneuvering to recognize the truth when it stood plainly in front of him. He announced that his firm would sign with no one other than the legitimate, sitting chief executive of Helix Dynamics, and that any attempt to install a replacement obtained through fraud would end their firm's involvement entirely. Within the hour, the board of directors, informed of the unfolding scandal by frantic phone calls from their own investors, convened an emergency session far more chaotic than the one that had voted Victoria out only that same afternoon. The vote to remove her was reversed unanimously, several board members practically tripping over themselves to distance their names from a decision that now threatened to become a very public embarrassment. Marcus Reed was stripped of his title before the session even ended, escorted from the building he had once hoped to control, his career unraveling in the same lobby where he had believed his plan would quietly succeed. Daniel Cole was terminated before the end of the day, along with two other members of building security who had participated in Victoria's removal, their employment records now permanently marked by a scandal that would follow them into every future job application. The emergency session itself, though Victoria only heard about it secondhand later that evening, had apparently descended into open conflict within minutes, several board members who had voted for her removal that same morning now scrambling to explain their decision to colleagues who suddenly understood the full scope of what they had nearly allowed to happen. One board member, an older woman who had known Victoria since the company's earliest funding rounds, reportedly stood and reminded the room, in no uncertain terms, that the board existed to protect the company's future, not to serve as a rubber stamp for whichever executive happened to arrive with the most persuasive story and the deepest pockets. The reversal, when it finally came, was not just unanimous but swift, every dissenting voice from that morning's vote suddenly eager to distance themselves from a decision that now threatened not only Victoria's career, but the reputations of everyone who had signed off on it. Victoria returned to the 50th floor at last, more than 2 hours later than planned, and walked into the negotiation room not as a woman who had nearly lost everything, but as a chief executive whose resilience had just been tested and proven in front of the very investors she needed to convince. The contract was signed before sunset, the largest deal in the company's history. And by the time the ink had dried, word of what happened in the lobby below had already spread through every floor of the building. Word of what had happened in the lobby traveled through the building faster than any official memo could have managed. Carried floor by floor through hushed phone calls and wide-eyed glances exchanged in elevators. Employees who worked for entirely unrelated companies, tenants who had never met Victoria Hayes and would likely never do business with Helix Dynamics, found themselves discussing the story in break rooms and stairwells, marveling at the image of a quiet stranger in a plain gray coat, revealing himself to be the owner of the very tower they worked in every single day. Somewhere in that spreading story, the details grew slightly exaggerated, as stories always do. But the core of it remained intact and unmistakable. A woman had been wrongly humiliated in public, and justice had arrived not with shouting or spectacle, but with quiet, unshakable authority. For Daniel Cole, the fallout extended well beyond that single afternoon. The formal investigation into his conduct uncovered a pattern of smaller infractions, stretching back nearly 2 years. Favors traded quietly for tenants willing to pay under the table, safety inspections signed off without ever being conducted, a slow erosion of integrity that had gone unnoticed, simply because no one with real authority had ever bothered to look closely enough. Ethan, upon learning the full extent of it, made a private decision that afternoon to personally review every management contract across all of his properties, determined that no employee under his ownership would ever again believe that cruelty toward a tenant could pass unnoticed or unpunished. Ethan had not followed her upstairs. He remained in the lobby long after the crowd dispersed, standing near the same marble column where he had first watched the chaos unfold, quietly overseeing the restoration of order in the building he owned but rarely visited in person. When Victoria finally descended after the meeting concluded, the deal secured, her exhaustion visible but softened now by relief, she found him still there, reviewing something on his tablet with the same unhurried composure he had carried through the entire ordeal. She approached him slowly, unsure exactly what to say to a man who had, within the span of a single afternoon, saved her company, exposed a conspiracy, and revealed himself to be one of the most powerful property owners in the city, without ever once raising his voice. She thanked him, simply and sincerely, and then asked the question that had been sitting in the back of her mind since the moment the screens above them first confirmed his identity. She asked him why a man with no obligation to her, a stranger who could have walked past the entire spectacle without a second glance, had chosen instead to intervene. Ethan considered the question for a long moment before answering, his gaze drifting toward the rain still falling softly against the tall windows of the lobby. He told her that he had built his fortune in a world where power was too often used as a weapon rather than a responsibility, where people with authority frequently chose convenience over fairness because no one ever challenged them to do otherwise. He said that the moment he saw her name badge and understood that an innocent woman was about to lose everything because a system built to protect her had instead been turned against her, walking away had simply never been an option he considered. Victoria studied him carefully as he spoke, noticing for the first time the quiet weariness behind his composed exterior, the kind of tiredness that came not from a single difficult day, but from years of carrying responsibility without anyone around to share the weight of it. She suggested they walk, and he agreed. And together they climbed to the rooftop terrace on the 58th floor, a space few tenants even knew existed, reserved for the building's owner, and rarely used by anyone at all. The city stretched out beneath them in the fading autumn light, rain giving way to a soft mist that blurred the skyline into something almost painterly. Victoria spoke first, describing, more honestly than she had with anyone in years, the isolation of leading a company that size, the constant suspicion required to survive in rooms full of people who smiled while calculating your downfall, the loneliness of success that nobody warned her about when she started building Helix Dynamics from a small rented office with 3 employees and a shared coffee maker. Ethan listened without interrupting. And when it was his turn to speak, he told her about the choice he had made years earlier to remain invisible, to build an empire without ever attaching his face to it, because visibility, he had learned early in his career, invited exactly the kind of manipulation she had endured that very afternoon. He explained that anonymity had protected him from flatterers and opportunists, but it had also isolated him in ways he rarely admitted, even to himself, leaving him surrounded by employees and tenants and business partners, yet fundamentally alone in every room he entered. Victoria nodded slowly, recognizing in his words a mirror of her own experience. 2 people who had built extraordinary success while quietly starving for the simple, ordinary company of someone who understood exactly what that success had cost them. Victoria asked him, quietly, why he had never simply put his name on the buildings he owned, why a man capable of such enormous influence chose instead to disappear behind lawyers and shell corporations and unmarked doors. Ethan answered slowly, telling her about his early years in the business, when he had briefly allowed his name to appear on a modest development downtown, and how quickly that small measure of recognition invited people who had never earned his trust to demand pieces of it anyway, investors who wanted favors, acquaintances who reappeared only when they needed something, a version of visibility that felt less like success and more like exposure. He told her that somewhere along the way, he had decided that the safest way to build something meaningful was to build it quietly, letting the work itself speak louder than his name ever could. Victoria considered this for a long moment, watching the lights of the city flicker on below them one building at a time, and she admitted, with an honesty that surprised even her, that she sometimes envied that kind of invisibility, the freedom to walk through a crowded lobby, without every stranger already forming an opinion about her before she had said a single word. They stood there for a long while, saying little. The silence between them, comfortable rather than awkward, the kind of silence that only exists between two people who have each spent years surrounded by noise, and finally found a moment of genuine quiet. As the sky deepened into evening, and the city lights below began to flicker on one by one, Victoria turned to him and asked, almost hesitantly, whether he might be willing to join her for dinner, not as a business courtesy or a formal thank you, but simply as two people who had survived an extraordinary day and might benefit from continuing the conversation somewhere warmer than a rooftop in the autumn rain. Ethan smiled, the first genuine smile she had seen cross his face since the chaos of the lobby, and he told her that he would like that very much. Neither of them mentioned business again that evening. They spoke instead about the ordinary things two guarded people rarely allowed themselves to discuss. Favorite restaurants, childhoods spent far from the city, the strange, quiet ache of building something enormous while feeling utterly unseen inside it. And for the first time in longer than either of them cared to admit, the conversation felt less like negotiation and more like recognition. Months passed, and the city moved on the way cities always do, forgetting scandals as quickly as they discover new ones. But inside the walls of that 58-story tower, the consequences of that autumn afternoon continued to unfold. Helix Dynamics not only survived the attempted coup, but thrived in its aftermath, the publicity surrounding Victoria's ordeal transforming her, almost overnight, into a symbol of resilience within an industry that rarely celebrated its women leaders with the same enthusiasm it reserved for men. New investors, drawn by both her proven leadership and the extraordinary story of the day she nearly lost everything, poured resources into the company's expansion, and within a single fiscal year, the corporation's valuation had grown beyond even her most optimistic projections. Marcus Reed, meanwhile, found no refuge in his betrayal. Word of his scheme spread quickly through New York's tightly connected business circles, and no serious company was willing to risk its own reputation by association with a man who had orchestrated fraud and bribery in pursuit of a title he had no right to claim. Daniel Cole faced consequences of his own, a formal investigation into the bribery, uncovering additional violations during his tenure as building manager, consequences that followed him well beyond his termination that same afternoon. The industry press, always hungry for a story with a clear villain and a clear survivor, spent weeks dissecting every detail of the scandal, publishing profiles that painted Victoria as a symbol of quiet endurance in a business world that too often rewarded ruthlessness over integrity. She gave few interviews, choosing instead to let the company's continued success speak in place of any carefully worded statement, and that restraint, more than anything else she could have said, earned her a level of respect among her peers that had eluded her during the years she spent proving herself through sheer output alone. Ethan, true to the habits of a lifetime, declined every request for comment, his name appearing in exactly one brief statement issued by his legal team, confirming ownership of the building, and nothing more, and within a few news cycles the wider public had already moved on, leaving the two of them free to build whatever came next without the added weight of outside attention. Ethan and Victoria, in the months that followed, discovered something neither of them had expected to find in the wreckage of that chaotic day, a genuine partnership built on something sturdier than either business or attraction alone, though both existed quietly beneath the surface of their growing friendship. Victoria began consulting Ethan on select real estate investments tied to her company's expansion, and Ethan, in turn, found himself drawn increasingly into conversations about technology and innovation he had never previously considered, subjects that came alive in an entirely new way whenever she was the one explaining them. Their meetings, which began as brief professional check-ins scheduled around busy calendars, gradually stretched longer, evolving into dinners that lasted well past the hour either of them had originally intended. Conversations that wandered comfortably from boardroom strategy into the quieter, more personal territory neither had allowed themselves to explore with another person in years. Colleagues began to notice the shift, the way Victoria's guarded expression softened whenever Ethan's name appeared on her calendar, the way Ethan, a man famous throughout his industry for his solitary habits, began appearing more frequently in public, Alongside a woman the business press had already started calling one of the city's most formidable executives. Neither of them rushed to define what was growing between them, both too familiar with the danger of moving quickly in a world that had already taught them harsh lessons about trust. But slowly, deliberately, the way two careful people build something meant to last, they allowed themselves to become something more than colleagues, more than allies who had survived a single dramatic afternoon together. The building management team, entirely restructured under Ethan's direct oversight in the aftermath of the scandal, implemented new safeguards designed to ensure no tenant, no matter their position or gender or perceived vulnerability, could ever again be treated the way Victoria had been treated that October afternoon. Employees who had once laughed and filmed her humiliation for their own amusement found themselves, in the months that followed, working under an executive whose resilience and integrity had earned genuine respect rather than mockery, and several of them, ashamed of their earlier behavior, personally sought her out to apologize, offers of contrition that Victoria, true to the grace that had defined her throughout the entire ordeal, accepted without bitterness or lingering resentment. On a clear evening nearly 8 months after that gray rain-soaked afternoon in the lobby, Victoria and Ethan stood together once more on the rooftop terrace of the 58-story tower, the same space where their conversation had first turned personal, watching the sun sink slowly behind the Manhattan skyline in shades of amber and rose. So much had changed since the last time they stood in that exact spot. Yet the quiet comfort between them remained precisely the same, perhaps even deeper now, tempered by months of shared decisions and quiet trust built one honest conversation at a time. Victoria broke the silence first, her voice softer than it had been that first evening, carrying none of the exhaustion or fear that had defined her that terrible afternoon. She told him that, on that day, standing in the lobby with security guards gripping her arms and a crowd laughing at her humiliation, she had genuinely believed she was about to lose everything she had spent her entire adult life building. A breeze moved across the terrace, carrying with it the faint sound of traffic far below. And for a moment, Victoria simply watched him, this quiet, careful man who had walked into her worst day, without any need for recognition or reward, chosen to make it right. Ethan turned to look at her then, the golden light of sunset catching the edges of the tower behind them, and he considered his answer carefully before speaking, the way he always did, weighing his words the same deliberate way he weighed every important decision in his life. He told her that she had been wrong that day. Though not in the way she might have expected, she had not lost everything that afternoon. She had, instead, though neither of them could have possibly known it in that chaotic moment, found exactly the right person standing quietly in the corner of a crowded lobby. Watching, waiting, ready to step forward the instant fairness demanded it. Victoria smiled, the kind of smile that came easily now, unburdened by the guarded caution she had once carried into every relationship, professional or otherwise. She thought back, briefly, to the version of herself who had stood in that lobby 8 months earlier, humiliated and afraid, certain that everything she had built was slipping through her fingers in front of a laughing crowd, and she found it strange, in a quiet and grateful way, that the very worst afternoon of her professional life had somehow become the hinge on which everything good that followed had turned. Ethan reached over and took her hand. An ordinary gesture between two people who had learned, slowly and carefully, that trust did not have to announce itself loudly to be real, and for a long moment neither of them said anything else at all, content simply to watch the skyline glow beneath a sky finally clear of rain. Below them, the city continued its endless motion, indifferent to the quiet victory of two people who had each spent years building empires in solitude, and had finally, against every careful instinct either of them possessed, allowed themselves to build something together instead. The rain that had marked the beginning of their story was long gone, replaced now by a clear autumn evening, and as the last light faded behind the skyline, neither of them felt any need to rush toward whatever came next, content, for the first time in a long while, simply to stand together and let the quiet speak for itself.